welcome everybody. My name is Bronson Bullock. I'm a professor of forest biometrics and quantitative timber management here in the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia. It's also my pleasure to serve as the Georgia Division SAF chair for the Society of American Foresters, and we're hosting this webinar here today as part of our role with continuing education. I'll start with some general introductions here. Our presenter today is Lynn Womack. She is currently with the Georgia Forestry Commission, has been there since 2009 and is with the Forest Health Group. She has her Bachelor of Science from Sweetbriar College and a Master of Forestry and a Master of Environmental Management from Duke University Nicholas's School of the Environment, and has worked in various roles across the Southeast, including with the Jones Ecological Research Center, conservation programs in Florida, and Tall Timbers Land Conservancy. So with that, we're pleased to have Lynn today talking on southern pine beetle and IPS, and some of the management implications and mitigation procedures. Around that, I wanted to mention to all attendees today that this will be available for CFEs and CLEs via the webinar portal. And I believe once we're done, you have to go back and then finish the webinar. There's like a button you click and then it finishes out that you've attended. I did also want to mention that we have our SAF, Southeastern Society of American Foresters, annual meeting coming up in February in Panama City Beach in Florida, and that will be February 15th to 17th. If you're an SAF member, you should be receiving emails and then a flyer about that. If you're not an SAF member and you're interested, just go to eforester.org and type in CSAF, Southeastern SAF, and we'd be happy to have you there. We've got the schedule figured out for that, and a lot of great presentations across a range of topics important to forestry, forest management in the Southeast. Okay, so with that, I did want to remind all participants we are recording this. This will be on the webinar portal. And at the very bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button with a little box in it. So if you have any questions or comments, we'll address those after the webinar. And Troy Clymer, who is also online here, Troy is the Associate Chief of Forest Management and has been with the GFC for 23 years, and is also, I'm very happy to say, the chair-elect for next year's Georgia Division SAF chapter chair for the division, the state society. So Troy will handle Q&A after Lynn Womack is done with her presentation. And so any questions or comments, please use that to type them in there, and we'll address those afterwards. Okay, if I missed anything, Lynn, Troy, I think we're ready. So with that, Troy and I are going to turn off our cameras and mute, and we'll let Lynn Womack take it from here. Thank you.
All right, that looks good. Hopefully we don't have any technical difficulties. Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Lynn Womack. I'm the Forest Health Coordinator at Georgia Forestry Commission. So I know that some of you may be in different states, but so this is geared towards Georgia, but most of what I say is relevant to anything in the Southeast, anywhere. And I have counterparts in every state agency in the Southeast. So if you have questions about what's currently going on in your area, you should reach out to them. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer those questions too. So let's get started. We'll talk about pine bark beetles today, how to identify them, what's gone on in Georgia in the past, where we stand now, and how to manage for the different species of bark beetles, pine bark beetles specifically. So in Georgia, this is where we are with our forest lands. We have 24 million acres of forest land across the state. That means that our forests cover about 2/3 of the state. If you added all that up, it would be about 4 of the states of Vermont in total acres. We are in a unique situation in that about just over 90% of our land is privately owned. So as far as management, we have a lot that we can go on and a lot of hands on the ground doing active management. If we divide those up, since we're specifically talking about pine bark beetles today, people might be interested in how that affects us here in Georgia. A little over 50% of our forest lands actually have pines, the various species of southern pines that we have in the South. And 28% of those are in planted pine. And then if you look down a little, about 17% in natural pine and 11% in that oak pine mix. So that adds up to a little over 50% of our forest lands. And of course, it's really important to the economy of Georgia, not only the products that we produce, but for jobs and also the ecosystem services that those forest lands provide. So when we talk about pine bark beetles, we really talk about the three groups or three types of beetles. The first group are the Ips species. We really lump them together. There are three different species, and they're all managed and kind of have the same signs and symptoms. So we just group them together and call them Ips beetles. You can call them by small, medium, and large, the 4, 5, or 6 spine, or you can call them with their Latin names with Ips avulsus. Ips grandicollis is the medium-sized one, and Ips calligraphus is the large one. And they all have, let me get my pointer here. These scooped out hind ends, which you'll show better in the next photo. And then of course we have southern pine beetle, which we all know can be the most destructive of all our pine bark beetles. And then we also have the black turpentine beetle. Okay, so here's just a different view. I kind of lied to you a little bit in that first slide, saying we have 3 species of Ips. We actually have 4 species of Ips, and I don't have a photo of it, but this Ips pinei, its range does dip down into like 2 counties in Northeast Georgia. So it's possible that we could be seeing that, but really the 3 ones that we deal with when we deal with Ips species here in Georgia are these 3. And then we have southern pine beetle and black turpentine beetle. So I'm going to start with just a little bit more information on black turpentine beetle, and then we'll focus a little bit more on Ips and southern pine beetle. So black turpentine beetle we know is attracted to stressed trees, lightning strikes, logging debris, wildfire droughts. Mechanical injury is a big one, and tree stress from hurricanes and tornadoes, which we all know lately has happened a lot across the Southeast. They're usually found in the bottom 8 to 10 feet of the tree down here, where you would actually see their signs. Usually they only affect a couple of trees at a time. And this is the one species that once that you know that it's there can actually be controlled with an insecticide with a bark spray. So you just need to find something that's labeled specifically for pine bark beetles. And I'm gonna just really stress that this is mostly in yard trees and it's single trees. And that's why it's really actually something that can be controlled with insecticide. It is a large beetle, the largest of all of our pine bark beetles. The signs that you usually see for it are these large pitch tubes. So these pitch tubes are created as the tree's defense mechanism against these bark beetles. As the beetles try to bore their way into the tree uses that pitch to push them back out. And sometimes these pitch tubes are usually about the size of a quarter for black turpentine beetle. And it's not unusual to find one of the beetles trapped in this pitch as the tree pushes those out. Black turpentine beetles, the female beetle comes in first, it sends out a pheromone and it attracts the male beetles. And then the females lay their eggs and they burrow under the bark. Black turpentine beetles have a long period from laying the egg to hatching out as an adult is about 60 to 90 days, and they only have about 3 generations per year. So they're much slower than our other bark beetles, which is a lot of the reason also why they really don't cause as much trouble. This is something that I've seen in the very northwest corner of Georgia in Cherokee County. This was a young planted pine stand, and they ran a fire through here that got too hot, and all these trees were extremely stressed, and they got black turpentine beetles in them. So really only in extremely stressed trees. So now we'll move on to Ips engraver beetles. These are ones that you see a lot in the summertime around lightning strike trees. Ips is a little different in how it works. Ips beetles, the male is the first one to find a suitable tree, and then it sends out a pheromone to attract the females. And then the females actually, they come in here in this chamber, and the females create these galleries, and they lay their eggs off to the side, and then the eggs start feeding underneath in the phloem tissues. Excuse me. So the way that we really can tell the difference between all of these bark beetles is it's rare to find the beetles themselves, but we have to look for the signs of them. And the most identifying features between the three groups of bark beetles are the galleries that they create. So I didn't really show you anything from black turpentine because it's very small. And you usually see those pitch tubes. Ips beetles can create, each of these species creates a different gallery under the bark. And they're usually either like this I or an H or a Y shape. So they're usually straight lines, and they're usually up and down within the tree. So Ips beetles are attracted to stress trees. We talk about Ips being a secondary beetle. So if this is a healthy tree, the tree is going to be able to fend off the beetles on its own using those pitch tubes and being healthy enough that those beetles can't invade them. But once we get stressors in a stand, especially things like lightning strikes, logging debris piled around the base of the tree, broken branches, trees that are nicked around skids from being skidded around, largest Ips beetle outbreaks we've had, of course, were due to drought. And then we do see them following hurricane and tornado damage. We do see an uptick in these Ips spots. They can be found anywhere from the top to the bottom of the tree. So it might be something that you don't actually see from the ground when you see their pitch tubes. They usually don't spread very rapidly. They typically, they are found in groups of 3 or 4 trees at a time. If one tree gets struck by lightning, the Ips beetles come in and they may get a couple of more trees around them, and that's it. They can be found in the same places as southern pine beetles when those infestations get larger. And I'll stress again that in forest settings, these things can't be controlled with insecticide. So the only time that insecticides are really used is, like I said, black turpentine beetle, but they can be used as a preventative measure in things like ornamental trees or special specimen trees. So we're not going to use insecticides in the forest setting. So we talked about the signs and what to look for and how to identify them in specific types of beetles. Ips engraver beetles, we talked about the galleries, but you have to peel back the bark. So some of the things that you might see with Ips beetles before you get to the peeling back the bark are the pitch tubes. The pitch tubes for Ips beetles are smaller, much smaller, about the size of a pencil eraser, maybe a little bit bigger than that. A lot of times they do have the reddish tint from having the sawdust mixed in with them. And they're usually found on the flat bark plates of our southern pines. You'll also find the boring dust that's caught on the bark plates or piled up around the base of the tree. And if you get to the point of seeing the exit holes, those beetles have already left the tree. Again, here are the galleries. This is the medium-sized Ips grandicollis. You'll see this is the gallery that the female has created. And she's come over here and laid her eggs, and now the larvae are feeding. Same thing over here. You can see the larvae in these little egg niches feeding and creating their way out. So ultimately, it's these galleries that kill the tree. There's enough of them that they end up girdling the tree and disrupting the flow of nutrients. You'll hear, and historically, a lot of people talk about blue stain fungus, and all 3 of these species do have, and you'll see it a little bit here in this picture. And the blue stain fungus basically gums up the flow of water and nutrients in the tree and really slows everything down, which creates another stressor. But ultimately, at infestation levels, it's these galleries that girdle the tree and end up killing the tree. So here's what you would really see on the landscape if you thought you had Ips beetles. They would be in groups, usually kind of in circular patterns, 4 or 5 trees, usually less than 1/4 of an acre. It happens very rapidly. Some people think that like the tree was fine, and 2 days later, it's pretty much dead. You can also see flagging, where maybe half the tree is green and half the tree is red, but it's usually only a few trees at a time. So like I said, historically, we only had these in beetle spots on about a quarter of an acre in size, 5 to 10 trees. But then something happened in 2016 and 2017 that really kind of threw that all out of whack and created some of the right conditions for us to have Ips beetle outbreaks. So in 2017, going into September, we were starting into a drought, and we had a record number of above 90-degree days between August and September. So I talked about Ips beetle. I think I talked about black turpentine beetles only having 3 generations a year. Ips beetles can go from egg to beetle in less than 30 days and have up to 8 or 9 generations a year. So if we extend the growing season and our temperatures that are okay for these things to reproduce, we are then extending and having extended numbers of generations per year of these Ips beetles. So we have drought conditions and stressed trees. We have extra generations per year, which is really not, it's really exponential when you start thinking about adding generations. And then we had the drought, and then going into the winter in the drought, we had above average winter temperatures. So here in Northwest Georgia, I remember going out the 1st of February with a news crew, and we found active Ips beetles in trees on the 1st of February in Floyd County up here around Rome. So that was a little bit different than what we typically see. Usually they go dormant, they hide out in the soil until the temperatures get right, and then they come back in April and May. So here's what that looked like. So in November of 2016, the entire state of Georgia was in drought, and at least close to 34% of it was in the highest level of exceptional drought. At my house, we had less than an inch of rain in July, and it didn't rain again until the end of November. So our trees didn't have the ability to fend off these Ips. So we started seeing a few trees dry in August, and we knew that it was dry. And this was typical this time of year, because usually we see thunderstorms and we see lightning strikes and we see spots of Ips. And by November of 2016, Oconee National Forest, and I'll show you the photos over there, Jasper Jones and Putnam counties, Georgia, started getting reports of major beetle spots. So they flew and they mapped approximately 140 spots. And they really thought that this was southern pine beetle from the way it looked in the air and the large acreage that was affected. So we and GFC also did some flights in December of 2016. And this is what US Forest Service found. All the red dots there are the 140 large spots that they initially thought were southern pine beetle. But once they got out on the ground and looked at them, we actually determined they were all Ips beetles. Nobody had ever seen Ips beetles at this rate before. So we did some flights also around those areas and some other areas where we had heard from landowners that there was a problem, and we estimated over 6,500 acres lost across the state to Ips beetles. This was historic for Ips beetles. We think there was over 6,000 small spots that we really didn't map, and we knew that there were close to 280 large Ips spots greater than 5 acres, which was unprecedented for Ips. But we saw them in all age classes, all species, and young longleaf, young loblolly, older longleaf, older loblolly. Just the drought was really taking a toll on these trees, and the Ips beetles were really taking advantage of it. So this is where the identification of what's going on really makes a difference, because this is where you're going to make your decisions for management based on what beetles that you have present in the stand. So the thing with Ips beetles is that really you don't want to go in there and create any more disturbance or any more stress on the trees that are there. You don't want to have cut surfaces that are releasing the resins in the trees that are in turn attracting more Ips beetles. So what we usually tell landowners is to just leave it alone. They can sacrifice a few trees in their stand, and those beetles will run their course. They'll get to the point where they get trees that are not stressed, and they really don't have anything to survive on. When we got to this point in 2016 and 2017, we really just had to let these stands go and see what was going to happen in the long run. We had to let the rains come back in and let the trees be able to fend off these IPS populations. And then we could go in and we could look and assess the stands. And really what we say is that if you have over 30 or 40% mortality, it's probably time to clear cut and start over. So that's where we were. A lot of those places over there in Oconee County Forest Service is now in the process of assessing those stands and creating a plan for coming in and replanting. So that's IPS beetles. We'll move on to southern pine beetle. Southern pine beetle is different in many ways in its biology and its management. So it's important to be able to identify the two. This is the southern pine beetle, Dendroctonus frontalis. Here on the left, it's about 3 millimeters long. And we have the female on the bottom and the male on top. Southern pine beetle is different than IPS beetles because in southern pine beetle, the female finds a suitable tree first for her place to come in and lay her eggs. She comes in, she finds a suitable tree. She releases a pheromone that attracts the male, and the male comes in and then, you know, they do their thing in the tree and they lay their eggs. The female lays the eggs and the male then sends out another pheromone that attracts other beetles that says, this is a suitable tree. Come on, guys. They have this aggregation pheromone. They have this whole biology that's much different than any other beetle that attracts a bunch of beetles. And once that pheromone is released, it brings in all of the other beetles. And then they have a third pheromone that once that one tree has enough beetles in it that it can't handle any more beetles, they send out that third pheromone that says, well, let's move to another tree. So they start moving on and on. So these are the S-shaped galleries wandering. I don't see a whole lot of symmetry to them to call them S's, but they're very much different than IPS beetles. You can see the egg niches where the eggs have been laid and the larvae are starting to feed. And again, it's the galleries that end up girdling the tree when you get enough of them in there. You can see there may be some spots of blue stain fungus here or there. So what are they attracted to? We know for sure that southern pine beetle loves an overstocked pine stand. Anything over 90 square feet of basal area, areas that have over mature pine stands or unmanaged stands. And really, they prefer a stress tree as where they go initially. But once they get in there and their outbreak status, they will attack healthy trees. They can be found from top to the bottom. They can spread very, very rapidly. We'll talk about how they spread. They can get to be large outbreak spots until they reach a physical barrier to stop them. So when we talk about a physical barrier, it could be a field. It could be a stand of hardwoods next to it that has no pines, or it can actually also be a stand of thinned pines that have been thinned down to less than 80 or 90 square feet in basal area. They can be associated with IPS and turpentine beetles. And we do know that healthy stand management usually prevents outbreaks. So I don't have the pictures of it, but you can research southern pine beetle outbreaks in Mississippi and they will show pictures of, I think it's all on national forest land, but they'll show pictures of young thin pine stands and young unthinned pine stands next to each other, where the unthinned stands have been completely destroyed, devastated by southern pine beetle outbreaks. And the thin pine next to them have no spots of southern pine beetle at all. So we know that healthy management, stand management definitely will prevent these outbreaks. Things that you can look for. One of the first things to look for when you walk into a stand would actually be if there are green needles on the ground. They once they're invaded by southern pine beetle, the trees start to suddenly drop their needles. So green pine needles on the ground are a good sign of southern pine beetle. Southern pine beetle's pitch tubes are usually, excuse me, a little more white than IPS beetles, and they can be found usually down in the bark crevices instead of up on the bark plates. And again, if you find the exit holes, the beetles have already left the tree. This is what it looks like from the air. This spot would have started over here, and a few beetles came in and they sent out their pheromones, and their pheromones get released through the stand to attract other beetles. And the beetles come in and you can see these trees are dead. And then it's like a wave of trees that are just kind of fading and fading and fading. But these trees are still healthy and have just now been infested. And you can see in this photo, there's really no physical barrier here to stop them. So they could move on until something comes in to stop them. Either you create a buffer or they hit another stand on the other side. So US Forest Service has put together these hazard ratings they have them for every state in the Southeast throughout Southern Pine Beetles range. And you can see that here, basically along the fall line is where we have our highest hazard rating. And interestingly enough, that is where the IPS outbreak was really concentrated a few years ago, just ironically. So these can be found if you just type in Southern Pine Beetle hazard rating. They're up there on the Forest Service website for every state out there. And this is how we actually, I'll talk about our cost share program, and then this is associated with it. So here's what's happened since we've been collecting data in Georgia with Southern Pine Beetle outbreaks. We've been doing aerial surveys for 30 or 40 years, and we get reports both from landowners and managers on the ground, and we also find Southern Pine Beetle spots through our aerial survey program. So in the 70s and 80s, we had lots of pine beetle outbreaks. The latest ones we've had, the big one we had in 01 and 02, and we had another small outbreak in 07. And you can see since then, it looks like we've had none. But if we zoom in a little closer, this is what we've had in the last 10 or 12 years here in Georgia. This one in 2017, 240-ish Southern Pine Beetle spots was all up in the northwest corner of Georgia. And most of that was in actually mixed pine hardwood stands with over mature pines, and that were just stressed at that level. And where we found them a lot lately is we're in these smaller plots where people have divided up large tracts into 5-10 acre tracts, and these little 5-acre tracts, they love their beautiful mature trees, and then the pines get in there, get to be 75, 100 years old, and they really are just very susceptible to Southern Pine Beetle. So we've seen a lot of that. We have had some outbreaks in the southeastern side of the state, but those have been easily controlled through harvest. And to put that into perspective, here in Georgia, our biggest wildfire was in 2007. And we know that fire caused approximately $65 million, dollars in timber damage. We know that Southern Pine Beetle outbreak that I just showed you in 01 and 02, which was about 9,000 spots. We know that it caused about $72 million in timber damage. So Southern Pine Beetle can definitely be more destructive to our forest lands than any of the wildfires we've had here in the States. So what do we do as an agency? We get a lot of funding through the US Forest Service to do our spring prediction trapping, our aerial surveys, and we also provide a Southern Pine Beetle cost share program to our landowners. Our prediction trapping, we follow their protocol, and we use 3 lures on one of these 12 funnel Lindgren traps, excuse me. And those are put out every spring as the red buds bloom, and we take the collections from the cupped once a week for 6 weeks, and we count the number of Southern Pine Beetles we find along with the number of clarid beetles. And clarid beetles are the natural predator to Southern Pine Beetle, and we have worked for the last 3 or 4 years with Dartmouth University, who put together a whole new prediction program for us for the results. And they came up with a new model. They changed kind of what we've been doing. And they found that the best input variables to come up with the predictions of the Southern Pine Beetle outbreak are the number of Southern Pine Beetles found per 2-week period, the number of clarid beetles found per 2-week period, and the number of Southern Pine Beetle spots in that county the previous year. So here's the Southern Pine Beetle, we call it a clarid beetle or a checkered beetle, and that's what we're looking for in these traps. And so we talk about these beetles, what really usually keeps them in check are a couple of things. It's native predators like these clarid beetles, things like diseases and funguses and pathogens will also keep them in check. And then weather conditions, being able to have cold enough winters to knock them back, and keeping our temperatures at a level that we don't have extended growing seasons and extended number of generations per year. So 50 traps statewide in 2022 looked like this across the state. And if you look at this, we had only one county, Carroll County over here, that was in this high number of southern pine beetle caught per trap per day, 15 per day over that 6-week period if you averaged it out. Everything else was medium to low, mostly low. I'll show you where we did actually have some activity over here when I show you our aerial survey map. And then we put that and we all upload. This is actually done across the Southeast. So these predictions are available for every state out there, and I'll show you where you can find them. This is the model that Dartmouth University has put together for us as managers. And they produce this as the probability of an outbreak. And so they're considering an outbreak as more than 50 spots in a county. And of course, only the counties that we have had traps in have results on this map. And you'll see that Carroll County had a 10 to 20% chance of having an outbreak, which is more than 50%. And then Dawson County up here had an 8 to 10% chance of an outbreak. And all the other counties that we trapped in 2022 had a less than 6% chance of having an outbreak. So the predictions are usually pretty good. I think they say they work at a 75% accuracy. So this is where that data is housed, spbpredict.com. And if you really, really love numbers, you'll see you can go to the prediction, you can go to the historic data, and you can also play with the model. And if you go to the main page and if you scroll down, it really explains the statistics of it all and how they got to the prediction and that sort of stuff. So all of that information is there. All the historical numbers are there, and it has most of the states throughout the Southeast in their historical data also. So this, now we'll move on to our aerial survey. We do this every year, anytime between July and September when the activity could be the highest. And we're looking for things like this with areas of dead trees, areas of trees that are flagging or starting to fade. And we map them all out. So we also use a special software developed by Forest Service that creates our flight lines, and we're able to log all of our spot information into. So in 2022, our foresters and just our GFC foresters alone flew over 6,000 miles. We had eyes on approximately 13.5 million acres across the state. And from that, and from landowner reports and manager reports, we only found 11 southern pine beetle spots. Do I think this is all of them? I think this is a really good representation of what's going on across the state. We are only as good as where we put eyes on the ground and where people report southern pine beetle. So if you're a manager out there and you think you have southern pine beetle, we're always happy to get that report. We'll put it on the map, we'll verify it. And if you need management advice, or if you're a landowner and you need management advice and what do you do next, then our GFC foresters are here to help you through that process. So again, Forest Service houses this data. They've gotten together with Clemson and they put together the Southern Pine Beetle Information Center, and they will put some of their predictions here that are Southeast wide. And there's a whole host of information here with publications and all of that historical data. So where do we stand now? Here's the current situation in Georgia. I showed you that drought map from 2016 with what happened with Ips beetles. This was just published this morning. You can see that only about 30% of the state is in drought conditions. This doesn't show everything. This, whatever variables go into this or what it shows. It doesn't show that we had 4 straight days of heavy winds in North Georgia due to the hurricane, and that lots of dead leaves are on the ground, lots of needles have blown out of the tree, and there's a lot of fuels on the ground. So take that as a factor. And we also have almost 0 rain in the forecast for the next 10 days. So I expect the amount of the state that's in drought to increase the next time they release this map next year. So just a little something that's guidance. You can find this yourself. If you just type in drought monitor and you're looking for specific areas, you can find that information out there yourselves. So the other thing we do as an agency is our Southern Pine Beetle Cost Share Program. This is funded through U.S. Forest Service as part of their Southern Pine Beetle Prevention Program. And we provide landowner assistance for both prevention and reforestation. And currently, those prevention practices that we provide cost share for are non-commercial thinning at $70 an acre, pine release, which would be spraying from competition from either hardwoods or invasive plants at $40 an acre, and prescribed burning at $5 an acre. You have to meet some certain criteria, but you can contact your local forester and they can work with you to see if you qualify for this. And then we do provide reforestation, and that includes loblolly / shortleaf, longleaf, and white pines, and also some money for reforestation of hardwoods. And that will include some work for site prep. This money usually is released just once a year, but if you talk to your local forester right now, if you have a stand that needs any of these practices or reforestation, then you can get on the list so that they will let you know when you can fill out the application for this program. And going back to that map, the hazard map, the counties with the highest risk, highest hazard of southern pine beetle actually get priority in this program. So there's a multiplier that it's that's used for the program to qualify. But there's usually a fair amount of funding out there and a lot of applications that get turned in and get funded. So what can you do as a landowner, a land manager, or a landowner? The best thing we can do and best thing that we know to do to prevent these pine beetle outbreaks are to manage for healthy forests. That means conducting the proper thinning, meaning maintaining less than 90 square feet of basal area, using prescribed fire when the conditions are right. We don't want to do anything that's going to stress those stands, but under the right conditions, this will help control competition. And again, we can control both hardwood competition and invasive species with herbicide spraying. Always monitor your stands. I tell people, you know, people have monetary investments in banks and in all kinds of different funds out there, but most of you that have forest lands have this as an investment also. And being out there on the ground is the best way to know what's going on. I wouldn't say that things happen necessarily quickly in these forest stands, but you can have been out there this winter and you come back this summer and you realize really how many invasive species you have out there that you really just, they've kind of been creeping up on you and you didn't notice. But things like Ips beetles and southern pine beetle, if you're out there on a regular basis, you'll notice if something looks different, you'll notice which trees have been dying, you'll notice the green needles on the ground that weren't there last time. And so you can mark those areas that have infestations and then definitely give us a call and we'll help you identify which kind of pine bark beetles you may have there in your stand. So I just want to give you a few visuals on why it's important to manage for healthy stands. And so this is what, you know, say this is a planted loblolly pine stand. It's 18 years old and it's never been thinned. And this is what it looks like. And then you add in there all of the hardwood competition and all of the invasive species that may be in there in the understory. And really, if you think about walking through a stand that has these hardwoods and these invasive species, there's not a whole lot of air movement in these stands. Versus if we were to thin this stand to less than 90 feet basal area, square feet basal area, there's a lot of air movement. There's a lot of space between the trees. So if we go back to this unthinned stand and we bring in our southern pine beetle friend over here, and they release their pheromones, if you have an unthinned stand, those pheromones really, they kind of get trapped. Think about this stage of an unthinned stand as, you know, a drop of food coloring in a cup of water. And it's really going to be very concentrated, but then, and it's going to kind of kill that. He's going to attract all the beetles in there. Even if some of these trees are healthy, you're going to start this outbreak situation because the pheromones have gotten to all of these trees in high concentrations and attracted more beetles. But if you go to an unthinned pine stand, and if this dark red area was how far the pheromones reached in an unthinned stand, if you drop that same amount of pheromones into this unthinned stand, the dispersal is going to be much greater and it's going to be very, very watered down by the time it gets to the rest of the trees in this stand. So it's going to not attract as many beetles at that outbreak level. So that's how this works, you know, whereas in the unthinned stand, this is 1 drop of food coloring in 1 cup. In a thin stand, this is 1 drop of food coloring, but it has to get through 5 gallons of water. So that's what we talk about with the pheromone levels and being able to disperse throughout the stand and really not attract beetles at that outbreak level. What do we do as managers if we find southern pine beetle? What we know works with the best results and works 97% of the time is to cut and remove that spot. But we also have to cut a buffer, and I'll show you what that means. And the second thing we can do is just cut and leave those trees there on the ground. And that requires a buffer also. So when we talk about a buffer, remember how I talked about southern pine beetle at outbreak level will go and move through trees until it gets to a barrier. That buffer creates that open barrier where that pheromone is really just dispersed and doesn't get to the next set of trees. When we talk about a buffer with southern pine beetle, I usually say at least 100 feet, 1.5, 2 tree lengths from, you know, what's in the stand. So if this was the active spot, we'd come in and wherever we know the last active tree is, and this is where flagging and monitoring definitely comes into play, then we would cut the buffer first, and then we could come back in and harvest everything inside of that buffer. Here's a really good picture of an active logging site where you can see where the active southern pine beetle is in here. You can see where the fader trees are, and they came in and they cut the buffer first. And as long as you can see where maybe they missed right here and they had to come back and cut this buffer. As long as you get ahead of the last active tree here, and you cut this buffer, you're creating a barrier. Then you can come back in and harvest everything inside of it. You know, what if, you know, this is a very large spot here by the time they got to this one. What if it's a small spot? You know, we'll just come in here and cut and leave this. And we do know that this works. Historically, people would talk about burning these piles. If you want to burn it, you can burn it. But you have to, it's very difficult to find the right conditions to burn that large debris and not have it get out. Historically, people have talked about spraying the down logs, and that just, those logs are going to dry out fast enough that the larvae that are in there aren't going to be able to survive. So, and I also don't think that there's an insecticide that's labeled for that situation anymore. So the 2 management practices that we really talk about now for controlling southern pine beetle, if you get it, are the cut and harvest the whole spot, or cut and leave the whole spot. But you have to include that buffer to break that area where the pheromones can go. I do want to say I did skip one thing when we talked about, I don't know if I can get back up without making you guys feel dizzy. Hold on. When we talked about the outbreaks we've had, I'm sorry if that makes any of you dizzy with me going back. These outbreaks that we've had in the past and why we don't see them at these levels anymore. We know that our management plays the largest role in this, but we don't know if there are other factors out there, things like climate, maybe the 1 or 2 degrees that they say that averages have risen or are going to rise is too much for southern pine beetle. We also know that in the last 5 years, southern pine beetle has made a migration to the north. It has been found in New York and New Jersey, and it has been found all the way to the north to Maine in this last year. So I don't know what that really means. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, they have found it. In places there, they find it, especially in Maine, they don't really see it at outbreak levels, but in areas where they have little pockets of warm areas in the winter that the cold doesn't kill back the populations, they will find it in traps the next spring. And the thing for them is that they don't manage for it. They have had no reason to manage for southern pine beetle. So some of their natural areas that they have up there are getting really devastated by southern pine beetle because they historically haven't had to manage more for it because it's not something that has been there in the past. So while we don't know if climate is one thing that's playing a factor in our outbreaks, we do know that it has caused southern pine beetle to migrate further north than its native range actually used to show. So with that, maybe I'll stop sharing my screen. And if Troy, well, here, I'll leave this down here for my contact information. And if Troy has any questions that came up along the way, I'd be happy to answer them.
All right. Yeah, I appreciate that, Miss Lynn. Always a pleasure and always a good refresher for me, and always seem to learn a little bit that I might have forgot. So we appreciate your time with us today. And if the group has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. So far, I haven't had any.
Okay.
But yeah, I just want to make sure we tell you thank you for your time and for coming and visiting with us. And it says, can this PowerPoint be emailed out for us to use as reference? And I think Miss Gail will have to answer that question for us.
I think she said it's recorded and posted on the on the webinar page. Wherever you
Okay.
logged into the webinar, I think is if you go back in a few days, they post it there as a recorded session.
Yeah, on forestry webinars. Yep, and she says that is correct. All right, says are infested and removed logs ever sold to the mill, or do the galleries prevent the wood from being usable in timber products?
So no, they can still be used. Some people say that the blue stain fungus will reduce the value of them, which may or may not be the case. And I think, but as long as you get in there and harvest them quick enough before they dry out, they can still be taken to the mill. When we get into times of outbreaks and the mills just have more wood than they know what to do with, those are definitely going to be the lower quality things that are taken in. But usually it's not a problem. If we get in there and harvest fast enough, the mills definitely take it, because the galleries are only really on the outside and the outer area, right underneath the bark. So they don't affect the quality of the wood inside that area.
And would you expect the same or similar effects within the urban forest?
So urban is a little harder, especially when we talk about small plots of land, because if you have 3 acres and your neighbor has 5 acres and there's no barrier in between them and your neighbor gets southern pine beetle, it takes harvesting almost every pine tree in that situation to be able to stop southern pine beetle from moving. And so we've seen that in some urban areas on the northwest side of Atlanta in the last few years. Once you get down to small parcel size, it's really hard to be able to control southern pine beetle. A lot of times it's just, it'll be one neighborhood area around a cul-de-sac or something, and then that whole forest, you know, that whole couple of acres behind everybody's houses loses the majority of their pine trees. And it gets stopped by things like the road or parks or something like that within the neighborhood. But urban areas are definitely harder. And then we talked about insecticides and preventative sprays, and once you get southern pine beetle or Ips beetles in the trees, spraying does not work to kill those beetles. The only time it can be used is really as a preventative in those trees. If you can do it, if you have a certain specimen tree that you want to protect, you can use an insecticide before, you know, just as a preventative to keep beetles from getting in the tree.
Usually that's done on like high value trees, isn't it, Miss Lynn?
Yeah, yes.
Some or historical.
Yeah, really large trees, or if there's a large one next to your house that you really, really want to protect. But I would say it's, you know, it's also, I mean, I know it's not cheap to get a tree cut down in your yard in an urban area. So it might be cheaper to protect it with, you know, an insecticide.
If you have an ongoing, I think it's supposed to be timber thinning, and Ips beetle spots are found, should harvesting stop, or would it be okay to continue and maybe cut those trees found with Ips?
I would say if you're thinning, if you are thinning the stand and you have if you know there's Ips in there, if you cut a pretty good buffer around those trees with the Ips in them and we're thinning the rest of the stand, you'd probably be okay. But it is, it's definitely kind of a gamble. It depends on what time of year it is. If you're in there at a time where, you know, in the winter time when you know you probably have enough soil moisture, you're not going to be in there nicking up a bunch of trees. You do run the risk of when you're cutting them, you're releasing that resin and the scent to attract some beetles. You know, if it's August and it's already dry and you find a few Ips in them, I definitely wouldn't continue with that because you know that those trees are already stressed.
And it goes back to monitoring as well. So make sure you keep an eye on that stand to make sure if they do start encroaching, you want to go ahead and remove them.
Yeah.
Let's see. Can changes in monitoring methods for southern pine beetle over the years influence the annual detection levels?
So we've always done aerial surveys. That's part of our grant that we get from Forest Service. I've only been with the Forest Health Program for, I don't know what I think is it 9 years. It all gets jumbled up in there together. 9 years that we've done the aerial survey very similarly in that entire time. And I know that, you know, for 20 years before that, we did. The only thing that's changed is technology. We've always been up in the plane, always been looking for spots. It's the same visual cues that we're looking for. We used to have the big paper maps. We had to figure out where we were, was the hardest part. That's really what's changed. When now I can sit there with a tablet and I can see the aerial photo. It's a very recent aerial photo and I can put a spot on the map. And when we go out on the ground to ground check it, I can find that spot relatively easy. When they used to have to do it with the big paper maps and their grease pens and getting out on the ground to ground truth, it was kind of the biggest challenge of all of it. So every spot that you saw on that aerial survey map that we labeled as either southern pine beetle Ips or black turpentine was ground truthed by one of our foresters. And we know that that's what was on the ground. And like I said, like that might not be all of them. If landowners and managers aren't reporting them to us, we don't know. But usually if a land manager or an owner has some trouble with beetles, they call us because they really want to know what to do and what they have on their property. So I feel pretty good that we capture a lot of it.
And besides stress factors, is there any truth to or reasonable expectation of cyclical reoccurrence within any of these pests?
So they used to think that with southern pine beetle, if you go back and you look at that graph, they used to think it was a 12 to 15 year cycle. You can see now we're in 20 plus years, since around 20 years since we've had a major outbreak. And there's a lot of questions out there right now. Like I said, those factors that I talked about at the end, is it just because we really have learned a lot and understand a lot more about southern pine beetle? Or is it things like the environment, their specific environment is changing and just, you know, a degree or two is enough that they're not going to affect our forests here in Georgia. Those questions are still being asked by researchers out there. They're still following the numbers. They're trying to correlate all those things. So historically, they did think that that was the case. We don't know if, you know, if we're just kind of sitting here waiting for that next outbreak or if what we're doing as land managers and researchers is working. But as far as Ips, there's nothing out there that shows anything cyclical with Ips. There is some questions out there right now, and we're working with UGA to answer some questions about if we can use prediction trapping like we do for southern pine beetle, if there's a process that we can do for Ips beetles that would be similar and be able to make those predictions for Ips beetle outbreaks.
It says, I've heard you should cut trees to stop the spread of an Ips infestation because they move from treetop to treetop. But I heard you should not leave wood on the ground in an SPV infestation because they move from the ground. So you can cut and leave Ips trees, but not southern pine beetle. Is that true?
So I'm not an entomologist, and I do get this question a lot, and I did ask some of the other entomologists across the state, and I think there's two thoughts on it, and I don't know if one's old school and one's new school, but individual southern pine beetles can fly like a mile at a time if they want to. They can get up out of a tree and fly. So again, we talked about people used to think that spraying with insecticide once you down the logs was important. And now we know that that doesn't really make a difference. So I think we learn a lot more. I think that like with Ips beetles, if you leave logging slash on the ground, that's an attractant to Ips beetles. It has that fresh resin cut. It has that fresh smell. It's going to attract Ips beetles to those trees. I think that southern pine beetle, if you lay a tree down, I do think that it can still get up and fly, but you're really reducing the population in there. All the larvae that are feeding under that bark, that tree is going to die and dry out fast enough. There's not enough food for the larvae to continue their life cycle. So you're really lowering the population numbers by doing that, but you're also not giving them a suitable food source within that spot, and that pheromone can't get dispersed to the trees next to it.
And when the pheromones are released, what is the average range that draws the other beetles into the stand?
I don't know that specific amount. I know there's some studies out there where they did some simulations with some, some of like the lures that we use, and that information may be out there if you look for it, but I don't know how far that is specifically. I'm sorry.
All right, good deal. That's all the questions I have showing. Oh, got one more. Are pheromones unique to each type of insect? Are they the communication media for insects?
Yes. So, I mean, specifically for pine bark beetles, different insects have different ways to communicate with each other, or different cues to find their host species. Some of them are visual, some of them are by touch, and some of them are by like scent, by pheromones. And so these pine bark beetles, their pheromone is very specific to them. And that's how, like with southern pine beetle, with the 3 lures that we put on the traps, we know that those are specific to the 3 pheromones that southern pine beetles release. The one that the female, they have one that smells like a tree scent, and one that smells like the male pheromone that is bringing in the aggregate pheromone that brings in all the other ones, and the other one for the female. Oh, I may have that mixed up. Anyway, those 3 are specific to trapping southern pine beetle. And there are lures out there that are specific to the Ips beetles. And actually the 3 Ips beetles have a different combination of pheromones for each species also.
And have you seen much southern pine decline in Georgia? It says they see a lot in southwest Alabama. It tends to look like Ips beetle at first glance.
We have no records of southern pine decline. We have no records of brown spot needle blight in Georgia. Alabama has a whole host of research about all of that and what's going on in their state. We have in the past year or two in the springtime seen a fair amount of needle cast across mostly North Georgia. But that's where we stand on those 2 things.
It says, so one can have a pheromone insecticide for each type of insect. Agreed.
Each insect can have its own pheromone. Yes.
It said insecticide.
Oh,
I
insecticide.
didn't mean that.
Well, insecticides are going to be different. There are specific insecticides for bark beetles, and it'll just say generically pine bark beetles. And usually those work. It has to do with where the insecticide is absorbed by the tree versus where the beetle is feeding under the bark, and having that beetle actually ingests some of that insecticide.
And is the clarid beetle the only natural predator for southern pine beetle?
There are other things out there, but it's the most prominent one. It's the one that we know that that really kind of keeps the populations in check the largest. And there are other things like other diseases and funguses that keep them in check also.
And any biological controls for the pine bark beetles?
No, they're a little different than most of the stuff we usually talk about in forest health, because they are native species, and we know that they have that clarid beetle. So we don't do the research on biological controls like we do some of the exotic species that we get, because we know that their native predators are here. already.
All right, excellent. Well, that's all the questions I got. I got a lot of thank yous, great presentation, great information. So really appreciate your expertise on this, Miss Lynn. Appreciate your time with us today. And appreciate Bronson leading us off and getting us rolling and helping us organize, and appreciate Miss Gail for all her work and setting up this webinar and working through all the bugs and getting us together to make sure it works out great. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Bronson. And again, thank you, Miss Lynn.
Thanks, Troy.
Yeah, thank you, Troy. And let me echo Troy's thanks, Lynn, for your presentation, all the prep work that goes into this, and then, of course, all your work in Georgia and the Southeast with the Park Beetles and the Forest Health Group. So very much appreciated from both a landowner and a tree perspective. So
Thank you.
with that, for everyone else, I believe you've got to go back to the webinar portal and click that link to end or complete your participation in the webinar. And as mentioned, this is recorded and will be available on the portal, I assume, in perpetuity, probably. So with that, I hope everyone has a great weekend, and go Dogs.